Thank you, Yossi. Thank you very much, Yossi. Thank you all for being here on a Monday afternoon after a long and eventful weekend, at least in Philadelphia. I am delighted to not introduce Dick, but introduce his kind of latest contribution to the world of journalism, and that is a new book called Elements of Nonprofit News Management. Dick and I have been friends now for 38 years. We worked together pretty intensively, actually, at the Wall Street Journal for over 15 years. We traveled the world together as a part of a kind of manifest destiny for the Wall Street Journal to become global. We took it to Latin America, we took it to Russia, where it actually thrived for many years until Putin shut down our joint venture there. I cherish him. I can't think of anyone literally in business or in journalism who has been more kind to me, more inspirational to me, and given me more wisdom, all in a really unique and lovely Dick Tofel way. So with that, I wanted to introduce this wonderful book. It is modeled to some degree after the simplicity, but the power of the Elements of Style, the Strunk and White classic. It has 6 chapters. We're not going to go deeply into any of them, but I'm going to use each of them as a kind of jumping off point for conversation. And I would urge you, please, to put your thoughts in the chat, and we'll try and keep track of those. We might actually just throw it open for conversation. We were very intentional in having this as a real proper Zoom, even though there are 200 people here, rather than a webinar where we can't see or hear from each other directly. So think of it as a big newsroom. The chapters are getting started appropriately. That includes defining a mission for a nonprofit news organization or any news organization, money, where to get it, the board, people, meaning the people you hire or don't hire, law, and the newsroom. Dick is an attorney in addition to his other experience, and sustainability. And on that, I want to talk about succession, since you've now stepped down from ProPublica quite intentionally, and I want to get inside that. So Dick, welcome and thank you.
Tim, thank you. And I treasure our friendship as well. And I really appreciate Lenfest's support for this book.
Well, this is the first book we published. I think it showed from time to time. I learned for the first time what an ISDN number is. I think we've got Amazon pretty well wired now, but I think you're #1 on the Amazon list of bestsellers for nonprofit news management books. So congratulations for that. I thought it would be fun to start with a very quick origin story about ProPublica. And embedded in that, and I asked myself this when you left the Wall Street Journal, then went to Rockefeller, and you and Paul Steiger started ProPublica. Why was it that you thought, after so many years in a thriving for-profit newspaper that did some pretty damn good investigative journalism, that the world needed a nonprofit newsroom at all?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is, I think we both saw pretty quickly what really broke in 2005, which was the business model broke in 2005, right? I mean, the news business was a cyclical business. It went up and down with the macro economy, and it did that consistently for many, many, many years. And then in 2005, really with the coming of consumer broadband, the business model fundamentally broke, and the business, as I think everyone on this call probably knows, has been the for-profit business has been in pretty consistent decline for 17 years now. Literally, for newspapers overall, obviously there are some exceptions, some important exceptions, but it's been in decline every quarter basically for 17 years. And so, first of all, the Herb and Marion Sandler wanted to make an important foray into investigative journalism, and were prepared to support it. And Paul Steiger really saw, I think before almost anyone else, maybe anyone else, that there was the potential to combine the platform of digital delivery with a new partnership model, where you could publish originally to the web, but also in partnership with other leading news organizations, especially exclusively, and get decent distribution right off the bat for a new kind of newsroom.
I want to come back to economic cycles and the challenges that they might present for nonprofit news, especially the next recession, which we may likely already be in. So put a pin in that. Take us inside some of the challenges and what opportunities you saw in partnering with people like the New York Times and others. You're a startup newsroom, albeit with a little bit of a silver spoon in your mouth, very good personal reputations, but obviously not the New York Times.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I mean, I just looking around these screens, I see a lot of people who've started digital news organizations, and you know, the most daunting thing is that on the first day, you have no readership at all. And so the question is, how are you going to get people, you know, if you level a tree in the forest, how do you get anybody to hear it? And so initially that was really the key from our perspective to the partnership model. Now, you know, you can't have any illusions. If you're a news organization no one has heard of and you run a story in partnership with the New York Times, 99% of the readers are going to be theirs. But a certain amount of them will come to understand you exist. I think we've all gotten a lot better in recent years about how to ideally leverage these relationships. I think, for instance, the exchange of newsletters at this point is an enormous advantage to digital startup news organizations in working with major partners. We didn't know that 15 years ago. But distribution is what you get up front. And of course, what they get up front is great content. And that was really Paul's.
I understand the exchange. How did you talk the New York Times into it, and how resistant were they at the end of the day?
They were skeptical. When we announced ProPublica in the fall of 2007, we gave the story exclusively to the New York Times because we could, right? I mean, you do that if you can. And Bill Keller, who was then the executive editor, was quoted in the piece as saying, "I know these guys, I like them, they're very nice. You know, maybe we'll work with them, maybe we won't." They were not our first partner. I think they were our 15th. But it was by the end of 2008, we started publishing in the middle of 2008. And before that, we'd had a big story, big for us, that really represented a very, very important turning point in the regulation of fracking in the state of New York with the Albany Times Union, and then on 60 Minutes, and then elsewhere. And so the Times came along, and by the August of 2009, we had run a story in the Times Magazine that in the spring of 2010 won a Pulitzer Prize. And the Times is never reluctant to run stories that might win the Pulitzer Prize.
And Bill Keller, of course, went on to become the executive editor of the Marshall Project, his own digital startup with the same model, right?
Right, and with which we were delighted to win another Pulitzer Prize.
Good for you. Coming back to the kind of structure of the book, getting started, you've said that a great mission must exclude something. What do you mean by that?
So I think a lot of mission statements and people thinking about missions generally, it tends to get very vague. You know, we will do all these 25 wonderful things. And what you want to think about when you look at that is, how much does that apply to pretty much everyone in the universe? Because to the extent it does, you're not really saying anything. There's nothing objectionable about it. But you really, the more you are focused, the more likely you are to be able to hit your target. And so you want to do two things, I think, in mission statements. One is you always want to say the obvious. So if you're doing investigative journalism, you need to say so. I make some fun in the book of the fact that I once reviewed a book about mission statements for the Wall Street Journal. And at that point, at least, the mission statement of Hershey's did not include the word chocolate. And the mission statement of Alcoa did not include the word aluminum. If you've done that, you've made a mistake. And the second mistake is to explain what you're not doing. Maybe not directly, but to have words that eliminate stuff that's outside your purview. You're not going to do everything. And the more you're doing everything, the more likely you are to come up short.
But bringing that home to ProPublica, was it not all things investigative news, or was it specifically about government and keeping the powerful accountable? What was the mission?
So, for instance, one of Paul's phrases that he likes to use about this, which I think has real power, is the phrase moral force. And so we do use that in the mission statement. And so that excludes, I think, some kinds of investigative journalism, a lot of investigative journalism about sports, not all of it, but some of it, a lot of investigative journalism about entertainment. I mean, TMZ, in truth, does really strong investigative journalism in many cases.
So is Kanye a legitimate story, or Ye a legitimate
Well, he
story
is
now
more,
because he's
he is more
transcended
this week.
entertainment?
Yeah, no, he is more this month than he was maybe a number of years ago.
Right.
You know, to the extent that he aspires to be the nation's leading anti-Semite, that's a thing. To the extent
Right.
that he's another singer, that's not much of a thing.
Right. Which is why he is buying a social media platform, presumably. I want to talk more about origin and about money, and where it's helpful and where it's not, and where to find it, and where to look. You've paraphrased Governor Ann Richards, who said of George Bush Sr., he was born on third base and thought he hit a triple, saying that ProPublica was born on third base and you knew it. What did you mean by that? And how did it affect the course of your business?
So we were enormously fortunate. We were given up to $10 million a year for up to 3 years by our initial funders. And they said that it would be a rolling 3 years at first, depending on how we were doing. So that's an enormous blessing. And frankly, we were very lucky in many ways, including, as it turns out, that we launched into the teeth of the Great Recession, which if you didn't have money was obviously a terrible problem. If you did have money, it was a fantastic opportunity. So for instance, Sam Zell was in the process of doing his very best to destroy the Los Angeles Times, something that he ultimately came up short on. But he did a lot of damage there, and it was incredibly to the advantage of ProPublica. ProPublica has had 3 managing editors since our original managing editor, Steve Engelberg, who's now the editor-in-chief, and all 3 of them came to us in the spring of 2008 from the Los Angeles Times. I mean, God bless Sam Zell. We always say that, you know, if we had to make a short list of the people responsible for any success ProPublica has had, Sam Zell would be high up.
And as my son likes to say, no shade, but how did you decide that the Sandler's money was okay? It's arguably unusual for an investigative news organization to be solely funded by one set of business people who might have their issues. How did you feel safe, and how did you feel you could keep your organization and your readers safe?
So first, we committed right at the beginning that they weren't going to be the only funders, even at the beginning. They were by far the preponderant funders. I'm not trying to duck that, but we had other launch funders as an important signal to people that we were going to need other people's money. And within a couple of years, we were embarked on a big effort to diversify the funding to the point where the Sandlers are now well less than 5% of the funding of ProPublica. But number one, they agreed extremely willingly and quite scrupulously that they would have absolutely nothing to do with the editorial product. We had a rule that I think they still follow. I'm sure they still follow at ProPublica, that nobody knows what they're going to publish in advance, including members of the board. And we were convinced that they would not try to interfere with editorial independence, and they did not.
Right.
But we also, look, it wasn't a secret. And I think this is the kind of thing you can count on the world to police. And we did.
So the ProPublica policy, just for the record, is that you disclose all donors transparently. You disclose as much about them as you know about them. That if it's an anonymous donor or it comes through a donor advised fund of a different name and you don't know who they are, you disclose what the IRS sees, correct?
That's exactly correct. And we, as people, some people on this call, many people on this call will know, you are not required to file publicly. You are required to file, but not to publicize Schedule B of your 990, which is the one that lists the donors. We always have.
Right. And that has set something of a standard. We looked to you and to Texas Tribune, who also looked to you, said Evan, for standards in this area, this and many others. I'm curious how you feel, having done this for 15 years, the face of American philanthropy has changed from the Fords and the Rockefellers to the McKinsey Scotts and Bill and Melinda Gates. How has the landscape changed in terms of who has money and who cares about these issues and what it means for nonprofit news?
Yeah, so I think this has been happening for more than 15 years, but I think it has changed enormously. You know, to give them credit, Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller basically invented modern institutional philanthropy as we know it. And for many years, their foundations and a few others, starting in the 60s with the Ford Foundation, really, not officially, but effectively, and a number of others, really constituted institutional American philanthropy. But as we know, in the last 30 and 40 years, there has been extraordinary new wealth created. I mean, we talk about the inequality gap in this country, and that is true and a very serious social problem. But the other side of that is enormous new wealth, a fair amount of it that's committed philanthropically. And that wealth has really come to dwarf traditional institutional foundations. So at this point, when the vast majority of these people who've made this new wealth in the last 30 or 40 years are still alive, that's really where the money is in America. And I try to make that point in the book. You know, Willie Sutton said he robbed banks because it was where the money was. If you're trying to raise money in this country philanthropically, yes, the institutional foundations aren't unimportant, but they are not the heart of the action.
That's a good lesson in and of itself. I'm curious, when you think about the scope and size of ProPublica, it is a national organization in some ways with global impact. You've said it. The 990 says it was about $40 million at last glance, 175 to 200 people. There's nothing of that scale on a local basis. I think the Texas Tribune, which is kind of the poster child for success in nonprofit news, is about $10 to $12 million annual budget. Not that the budget is the be all and end all in terms of their news impact. It's not. There are NPR stations. I saw Jim Schechner's on this call from New Hampshire Public Radio that are larger. But talk to us a bit about kind of national dollars versus local dollars. You've straddled the two through the ProPublica local news initiative.
So in the first years, and really until the last few years, the vast bulk of the money coming into nonprofit journalism was national. But I think it has been clear for at least 6 or 7 years now that it was going to be necessary for much more of it to be local if we were going to do what we need to do to save local journalism across the country. And, what Jerry Lenfest did in Philadelphia is very much emblematic of what we need in very large measure in communities around the country, and I think are beginning finally to get. If you want to operate at both levels, as ProPublica does and has wanted to now for about 6 years, you're going to wanting to be tapping into both of those streams. You know, and it's early days on the local level in some places. In others, there's been more progress, but I do think that's the space to watch.
Well, that's our space, as you know well. For anyone that doesn't know the full story, very briefly, Lenfest was a cable mogul who sold his business to Comcast and dedicated his life to philanthropy and pledged to give away all of his money, which he largely did. And he bought the Philadelphia Inquirer at the age of 85 and then donated it to the Lenfest Institute as a nonprofit owner. So we raise and give about $5 or $6 million to investigative news, diversity efforts in the newsroom, and technology and product efforts to the Philadelphia Inquirer, but at least that to the rest of the news ecosystem, all of it focused on local. So the mission was both to help transform and transition the Inquirer to a public good, and to help others do that around the country, for profit and nonprofit. You talk a lot in the book about boards of directors and a kind of no jerks rule, and some sense of how Herb Sandler thought about boards. I'd love to hear how you thought about them, how he thought about them, any parting of the ways there might have been there, and what advice you have for the rest of us in constructing and keeping fresh boards of directors.
Yeah, I would be extremely unhappy to think that there was a lot of daylight between me and Herb on this, because basically everything I know about this I learned from him. What Herb said was that you want to have on boards of directors, first and foremost, people who can help make the mission work. Money is a big part of that. It's not all of it by any means. The other critical part, which we've already talked about a little bit, is editorial independence, of people who have a sufficient level of modesty to be willing to sustain that. I mean, if you're on a board of a nonprofit news organization, in effect, you are sort of the publisher collectively. And part of that means that when your rich and powerful friends call up and are very unhappy about something that's been published, you need to tell them something along the lines of, I'm sorry you feel that way. I guess maybe in theory there's something I could do to help you out, but I'm not going to, and you should speak to my friend the editor. And that requires a degree of modesty, which is unusual. Beyond that, or not, at least not universal among people with wealth and power. But you can find those people. The second thing is you need people who other people want to go to meetings with, very frankly, because they're interesting, because they're committed, because they bring a diversity of perspectives and backgrounds to the work. And part of that is the flip side of that, in turn, is, as you say, the no jerks rule. You don't, as we all know from having been in a gazillion meetings, one person kicking over the furniture or making life really unpleasant for people personally can ruin a meeting and make people not want to go back. So you want people who will contend about ideas and will stand up for what is right, but not people who will be obnoxious doing it. And so that's really important.
And is this a fundraising board or an advisory board, or what was the basic DNA of the ProPublica board? So
I think it does the things that you want a nonprofit governing board to do. It picks the leadership. It sets, in conjunction with management, strategy, and it evaluates the leadership on an ongoing basis, holds the management to the strategy and helps them shift it as need be, and makes it possible for the machine to go. And that means supplying the resources, but also helping to find them.
There's a lot of focus in the book, just as there was a great deal of focus at ProPublica in how to recruit, attract, retain, or not the best people. I think it's Scott Klein, who's on the phone here, who was one of your product people who was just left to go to the city and run product there. So you've not only attracted a great deal of talent, but you kind of seeded the industry in a really positive way. I think the Wall Street Journal did the same thing in its heyday. You've talked about 20th century jobs and 21st century jobs. If you could define that and talk to us about some of the 21st century jobs and why they're necessary and what you mean by them, that'd be lovely.
Yeah, so I think this is a very important thing as people think about the workforce of a modern newsroom. 20th century jobs are reporters and editors, and a few others, but the heart of it is reporters and editors. That's the part that comes most easily to mind. If you have people, however, who were brought up too much in that world, which is a nice way of saying they're old like me, then what they may miss, and it is critical not to miss, are what I call the 21st century jobs, which are just jobs that didn't exist in the 20th century. Audience, product in the modern sense, engagement, data journalism. These jobs, I think one thing that we experienced at ProPublica, and I think continues to be true across the industry, is the increasing proportion of your entire news staff that needs to be in 21st century jobs. And I think if you're going to have a fully effective modern digital newsroom, those are necessary. And I think they're often left out in the early planning process or in the picture that founders sometimes have in their heads.
I noticed in the chat that Tony Cuffey, who is one of the heads of advertising at the Philadelphia Inquirer, is here, and it reminds me to ask you, did you ever think about other forms of revenue besides philanthropy? Was there, and including membership, but was there sponsorship revenue? Was there events revenue? Did you want to create the Davos or the TED Talks of American journalism? Is philanthropy the whole ticket to success in nonprofit news by definition, or not?
No, I don't think it is by definition. The more earned revenue you can get, the better, especially if it's sustainable. I think it's much harder than many people outside the field think. And I think it's much harder than many people starting things up think. The whole problem, the thing that gives rise to the need for all these news organizations is the advertising problem, about which you, Jim, know infinitely more than I ever will. But suffice to say,
that is part of the problem,
that it's going away. Beyond advertising of various kinds, sure, events are great, but remember, with a nonprofit organization of any kind, top line growth is irrelevant, because top line growth matters to a startup in the for-profit world because the company can be valued on the top line. Nonprofit organizations of any sort can't be sold. They don't have enterprise value. So multiplying by revenues gets you no place. So you need bottom line. If you have an event series that can produce enormous revenue, net revenue, great. The Texas Tribune has that. Bravo for them. But Evan Smith who was the indispensable man in making that happen, is, in my experience over the last 15 years, pretty close to unique. But if you have another Evan Smith in your town or your state or in the country somehow, God love you, and go to it. Data journalism, we tried that at ProPublica. They still do. We make some money off of it. Ebooks, we made some money off of. Movie rights, we made some money off of, and continue to. I think it's great. I don't think I've seen any serious indication that it is a very big part of the mix of what you need to make a place go in very many places.
So you've advanced a kind of Tofel's law or Tofel's rule of raise at least 18 months of operating expense before launching a nonprofit news organization. How did you get to that number, and what did you mean by it?
Yeah, so I wouldn't want to call it a law because, you know, but it's a guess, and it's a guess based on the fact that the kind of money that you can get before you launch is very different from the kind of money you can get afterward. Before you launch, you're talking about a dream. You can, I mean, whoever you can get to buy into your dream, that's great. But there are a lot of people who are not going to be willing to support something until they've seen it, and not just for a day. They need to see it in action. They need to see what difference it makes. And so you can expect something of a lull, I think, between when you launch and when you convert those people. To me, the analogy, I hope this works for other people, it works for me, is there are people who can visualize what an apartment or a house will look like if it's painted in ugly colors and badly furnished and in disrepair. I have never been one of those people, right? My wife actually can do that, and so that's wonderful. But for me, unless it's freshly painted and nicely furnished, I can't see what it's going to be like. And I think there's sort of the same distinction in donors. So to get the second group of donors, the ones of less vision like me, you need enough money to be going for a while. Mm-hmm. And that's my best guess of what a while is.
That's very, very helpful. We're at a little past the halfway mark in our 1 hour conversation here. Would love any questions that people want to drop into the chat. Yossi Lichterman has also been putting in both PDFs and links to the book, where you can download the fully designed manuscript of Dick's book. You decided to step down as president. You were president or CEO, co-CEO?
President and co-CEO. Steve Engelberg, our editor-in-chief, was and remains co-CEO.
Got it. You decided to step down after some 15 years. The ProPublica is doing great. It was and is in its heyday. Why leave in your prime and in the prime of the publishing operation that you helped build?
So I feel very strongly that if people stay anywhere as the boss or one of the bosses, that eventually they will have stayed too long. And I hope I got, and I like to think on my good days that I got out ahead of that. I mean, I'm a big American history fan, and one of the ways I sometimes sum this up for people is Franklin Roosevelt's 4th term as president was something of a disaster, and he was Franklin Roosevelt. So no matter who you think you are, this rule probably applies to you.
Well, you said when I asked you this privately, if you stay too long, you will have stayed too long. So that's kind of axiomatic, but nonetheless true. His 4th term did end badly, at least for him. There's a question from several questions coming in. Thank you. Danny is asking, I've been wondering why the Corporation for Public Broadcasting doesn't seem to be a model for supporting local news. Any thoughts about a new parallel federal initiative? I know you're skeptical of federal money or government money at all getting near news, but it's a good point. It's worked pretty well for NPR. You know,
it has. I am well aware that a lot of people disagree with me about this. I think that the Corporation for Public Broadcasting is sort of a historical accident. I think that even people who don't agree with me would agree that the chances of starting something like that in today's political climate would be essentially zero. I think that, and it remains, under threat from time to time. Every time the Republicans have taken control of Congress in recent years, they have threatened to do away with it. They have not done it yet, but I don't think it's inconceivable that they would try. And I don't like the idea of the press, which I think is one of the critical responsibilities of which is to hold the government accountable to being at the mercy of the Congress. I will also say, I think we have a hard culture for this. This works in Britain very, very well with the BBC. But the Brits, and they're maybe becoming more like the US, but they really have ultimately a culture of institutional self-restraint, which we don't in this country. And to me, the surest proof of that is, the Brits also have an unwritten constitution. My view is that if this country had an unwritten constitution, it would have a civil war within a week.
Oh, nice. Well, you got a laugh out of someone on the Zoom. I would just point out that it was the British press that compared the tenure of the outgoing prime minister with a head of lettuce most recently. So they might be more like us than we would hope. It was a wonderful observation, which I share, and a question from your friend Barbara Rabb, who is with Logan. The observation is that, quote, I've always thought ProPublica's impact report was both really smart, but also such an obvious tool that others should imitate, yet few do. She asked that Dick please talk about the importance of proactively telling stakeholders and potential shareholders or stakeholders about your impact. Why is this so much harder than it looks?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for that, Barbara. Thank you. I wrote a fairly long white paper about this almost 10 years ago at the request of the Gates Foundation. I did it for two reasons. One, I thought it was a very important way for us to keep ourselves on mission, to focus on this, and that transparency was the key to doing that. Doing it in public was the key to getting it done right. And I think that has worked out pretty well. The second reason is not everybody should measure how they regard success the same way. I would never suggest that. It goes back to mission, and missions are different. But I think if you are intentional about specifying how you're going to measure your success, you can take for yourself a great deal more control over whether people will consider you a success. You don't have to care about whether you think that changing things in the real world, like spurring legislation or changing regulatory reform or getting bad guys put in jail, is the be all and end all of journalism. That's it for ProPublica. There are many other ways to measure success, but I think what we tried to do there, and what I always urge people across the board, is take control for yourself of how you are measuring whether you are succeeding. And one of the keys to that is make sure you are measuring something at which you would not necessarily succeed. If the game is rigged, you can't fool all the people all the time, and people aren't going to be impressed.
What's always impressed me is the focus on outcomes and not outputs. It's easy to talk about how many articles we're publishing, how many partnerships were forged, but the laws changed, the crooks fired, the IRS statements exposed, that kind of thing is right. The most.
But I think for other news organizations, similarly, it can be the citizens engaged, the people informed, the resources provided. It can differ from mission to mission. But the idea of of seizing control of the agenda and not letting other people, frankly, including funders, dictate it is important.
Mhm. Yossi has dropped into the chat both the latest impact report, or a collection of them actually, and the white paper that Dick was referring to a moment ago. We were talking about people some time ago, and I kind of cut straight to what's a 21st century job and what's a 20th century job without stopping at first base, which is what sort of people you were drawn to, how you felt about the people accomplishment at ProPublica, anything you might have done differently with the benefit of 2020 hindsight.
Yeah, I mean, I think we built a real culture at ProPublica, and we tried to be very intentional about it. I think I saw before the screen disappeared that Talia Buford was here, and she's doing amazing work strengthening that in a much more intentional way than we did at the outset. So I think, you know, that kind of culture building is really important for any news organization. Let me just say one thing that I do want to say about the book, just so people don't think it didn't occur to me. There is a big part of this is to have a diverse workforce in every way. There is very little in this book about that, or a few things, but there's very little. And the reason there's very little is not because I don't think it's important. I actually think it's critically important. And I'm very proud of the record we've had there, but although, you know, there's a lot more work to do. It's because I don't think I have anything, frankly, to say on this subject that has not been said better, sooner, and more articulately by others. And I tried to limit the insights in the book to things that I thought might actually be genuine insights of mine that I thought people might be missing. So it's very important to me that people not make that mistake of read this and go, well, what about? Yeah, I understand that.
Thank you. Thank you for mentioning that. Yossi, could you bring the full screen back? I'd love to feel like we're in a newsroom and we can see everyone's faces, and then people can raise hands or just speak out. You can wave or put up your little digital hand, which is always fun. Yeah, Ken Ward.
Hello. Thanks. Hi, Dick. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about what you see as the difference in the revenue streams that local and national nonprofits are going to need to focus on.
Yeah, so first of all, it's a really good and thoughtful question. And for people who don't know Ken Ward, I just want to say I have a number of friends who I think of as geniuses, but most of them are not certified as such. And Ken Ward is. He is a national treasure, as is Mountain State Spotlight, which he helped start. So I guess the first thing is, in most communities, you're not going to be able to get membership to be a really significant amount of money locally. You know, in New York City or Texas or the California, maybe you well can. But in places that are much smaller, that's one difference. So I think membership is important, but it has a much more, unfortunately, that's just going to be more limited. On the other hand, it is possible that advertising and sponsorship can be more meaningful, in part because the digital revolution, I think, has the smaller place you are in America, and I see this now with my consulting clients especially, I think it's a pretty safe rule. The smaller place you are in America, the more meaningful advertising remains. Will that always be true? My hunch is actually that it won't, that this is something that is coming in stages, but it is still true today. So that's one thing. It also may be possible to have more meaningful events. Again, there's probably a sweet spot in the middle, big enough to attract a lot of people, but small enough to be able to command people's attention. You know, in New York City or in Los Angeles, your chances of putting on the most interesting event of the evening are really low. In other places, that may be quite different. So those are just some thoughts. And I don't want to ignore the elephant in the room, Ken, particularly when talking to somebody from one of the frankly poorer places in the country, is that to the extent you're depending on rich people, and I think a lot of this business is, there are many fewer of them in some places than in others. And that's a big problem. And I don't have a great answer to it, but I do want to acknowledge that it's a real thing.
Other thoughts and questions? I'm going to throw one out.
Hey, Jim, just to interrupt, a couple folks do have their hands raised.
Oh, I'm sorry, April.
hi.
April, I think is from Canada. Tell us where you are, and you had a question in the chat about taxes.
Yeah, sure. Not actually about taxes, but I teach at a journalism school in Toronto, and I'm actually working on a research project trying to explore the potential for philanthropy to support journalism in Canada. We just had some changes in the tax rules that now allow news organizations to become nonprofits and accept donations and issue tax receipts and get support from foundations. But so far there are only 8 in the whole country that qualify for this status. So I was just wondering if top of mind you could give any advice, since we're just starting out, and the things that we can do in Canada as news organizations and funders to, say, perhaps avoid some of the pitfalls that you've been addressing in the United States already, because you have so much more experience with this.
Yeah, so I don't actually think it's pitfalls. I mean, the what we talked about earlier about independence is certainly critical. You know, and I know some Canadians and I have visited Canada, but I would not pretend to be an expert on the subject. I would say one of the greatest strategic advantages in many ways of the United States is its philanthropic culture. It may also have some drawbacks in the limits of social welfare progress in some ways, but in things like nonprofit journalism, at least so far, it's a great advantage. I would, subject to being just frankly factually wrong, my instinct would be that you'd want to ally as much as possible with other nonprofit actors in Canada to try to instill a greater philanthropic culture generally. You know, Americans really believe in giving away a certain portion of their money. And to me, the greatest illustration of this has always been the year-end fundraising that goes on in this country. And if anyone who's ever watched it pour in, literally in the last 72 hours of the year, when people ask, it's astonishing. And it was based in many ways, it remains based in this sense of that there's a tax exemption, even though, you know, in the last 5 years in America, under the Trump tax reform, the number of people who can itemize their taxes dropped from 30% of the country to 10% of the country. So the overwhelming majority of people who make their charitable contributions at the end of the year actually aren't gaining any tax benefit at all. But either they don't know that, or it's just an impulse that's left in this country, and it goes very deep.
That's lovely to hear, actually. Other thoughts, other questions? Danny.
Thank you. Just a comment. We're trying to, and I have a question after that. Thank you, Dick, for your book and for being here, and for the email you sent me a year ago that inspired me to continue to convert my fledgling for-profit news organization to a nonprofit. Which
Jenny, where are you based?
Olympia, Washington, an hour south of Seattle. So the comment is, we're trying to identify people who are 72 years and older and are subject to a minimum or requirement that they contribute, that they pull out a minimum of a certain amount of money. It's called a minimum
Required minimum distribution.
required minimum distribution. Them's our people. Now, they might not know it yet, which goes to the question I have. And that's simply this: we're trying to train some of the local philanthropists that journalism is an excellent category for philanthropy. And I'm looking around for third-party proof of that. I'm wondering if your book would be something I should hand a donor, or whether that's your next book.
Maybe the next one, Danny, and this one really is sort of how to get under the hood and tune the car, I think.
Okay.
Rather than why to buy a car. Look, all of this talk about democracy being under threat in this country, which I very much unfortunately agree that it is, I think that is a strain of that is the argument for journalism. And so, I mean, the good news is in that way, people are talking about it all the time. And I think it should be relatively easy to link back to that.
Well, it's a little bit abstract when we cover hyper-local news to talk about national issues.
No, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the reasons why democracy is important, the reason why it's important to scrutinize local government, the reason why if nobody's at the school board meeting and nobody includes reporters, nobody will know what's happening. Civic improvements. I think that the loss of journalism is actually much greater at the local than at the national level.
There's a question from Brooke, and I think April raised her hand again.
Hi, yeah, I work with Cardinal News, which is a nonprofit newsroom out of Southwest Virginia. I was just wondering if you had, one of our big things is that we advertise ourselves as like nonpartisan. And I was wondering if you could talk about the pros and cons of sponsorships versus ad revenue, given that, and if there's a way to kind of advertise sponsorships in articles or newsletters with while maintaining that kind of nonpartisan look and feel for everyone.
So, I mean, honestly, to me, sponsorships are a kind of advertising. But I think the line you want to draw are in almost all of these things, the lines are very closely analogous to what they always were in the print business. I don't think there's actually, there was a thought when digital news revolution began, that there would be a need for a lot of new ethics. I actually think that it turns out there isn't. The old ethics work mostly just fine. It's a question of enforcing them. So you really do obviously want to maintain independence between the editorial product and the advertising side. But I think once you do that, following traditional rules, most of it falls out that way.
There was a question and observation from Monica Medina McCurdy in the chat about something you actually just wrote about recently, Dick, about why doesn't ProPublica have a stronger presence or any presence on Instagram and TikTok? And I'd like to frame that in a kind of forward-looking question about, since we're close to time, what is happening in nonprofit journalism and journalism in general that you are very, very excited about right now, including potential for new platforms, to Monica's question. And what is it that would keep you up at night if you were still running ProPublica?
Yeah, so the first thing is just understand, I've been gone from ProPublica a year, although my impression is that they've actually done a pretty good job on Instagram, given the kind of work they do. And I'm not on TikTok, I think they're not there yet, but you should go to them on that. I think a lot of progress is being made in local nonprofit journalism around the country. I'm very excited about that. What scares me is that whether it's not happening fast enough. I did write about TikTok and the need, I think, to take it more seriously. And the reason I think it's that we need to take it more seriously potentially is the degree to which in people under, say, 35 is what the numbers say, it is increasingly being used as a way to search for news. And, you know, Google, it turns out, is one of the most important innovations. This is not a secret, right? That has happened in the last 25 years, and it has been transformative in many ways of many things, including the news business. If Google is actually going to be threatened generationally, the thing that threatens it will be something that you'll really want to have a really strong handle on.
So that means what on a day-to-day basis, hiring lots of younger people with non-traditional news backgrounds, technologists, product people?
It certainly means hiring people who are thinking about this and who, if the whole thing terrifies you, are ahead of you. It also means staying innovative. The scariest thing about having a state-of-the-art 2022 newsroom is you don't want to wake up in 2025 and have a state-of-the-art 2022 newsroom.
I don't want to close on a negative note, but I think it's very, very important. I don't know whether you remember this, but we were in a meeting together with then CEO Peter Kahn at the Wall Street Journal, and Dick Tofel raised the specter of the next American recession, when the next recession comes. And Peter Kahn said, Dick Tofel has correctly predicted 10 of the last 3 US major recessions. And what happens to local news? What happens to nonprofit news? What happens during the next recession? And what should we all be thinking about now?
Yeah, I mean, so there are these secular factors that are hurting advertising. Cyclical factors.
I guess my question is this sector immune to cycles because we're out of the advertising business?
Right. I doubt it. I think one of the things we've got to be really careful about is, for instance, circulation, newspaper circulation and other kinds of circulation basically used to be pretty immune to that. Advertising wasn't, but circulation largely was. We have not seen a real recession since the growth of membership, right? This all started more or less after the Great Recession. And the recession of 2020 lasted 5 minutes. And so, I mean, it was literally the shortest in history. By the time a lot of people understood it was happening, it was over. So, you know, will membership be affected? Will subscription, to the extent that people have paywalls, there's not very much of that in the nonprofit sector, but will that be affected by a recession with a much larger number of subscribers? I think those are two really important things to keep your eye on whenever the first real digital revolution recession occurs.
What makes you most enthusiastic, optimistic, and upbeat about the future of this business? I think one answer is the people on this.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, Jim, that is what, I'm sorry, but that is what I was going to say. I mean, I'm just scrolling through, you know, when I see people like Wendy Thomas and I mean, I'm just going at random here, Rebecca Foreman and Becky Pollack and you know, I mean, on and on and on, Akash Mehta, people throughout the country who are doing this work, many of them of relatively recent vintage. I mean, Mary Margaret White and her colleagues at Mississippi Today, who I believe are on their way to winning a very well-deserved Pulitzer Prize for public service in Mississippi. That's what makes me the most excited.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here, for spending so much time with us, all 125 of you. And thank you for your friendship and your inspiration and your work, Dick. I hope you'll be doing this for a long, long time to come.
Thanks, my friend. Great to
Thank
see you all. Thanks very much.
Terrific. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for being here. We'll send out an email with the recap. And if you go to nonprofitnewsmanagement.org, you can download a PDF, and we'll make sure to get you a print copy if you've signed up for one as well. So thanks so much.